Hi, my name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm the Director of the Center for Work and Democracy here at ASU, and I'm here with Chris Brooks, who's joining us from Detroit. Chris is a columnist for Jacobin Magazine, and until quite recently was Chief of Staff of the United Auto Workers, working with Shawn Fain as he endeavored to rebuild the United Auto Workers. Welcome. Glad you could be with me today, Chris.
Excited to be here.
So Chris, why don't we just start a little bit by telling us a little bit about your background in labor and sort of how you got to the position of the Chief of Staff of the UAW.
I started to cut my teeth on community organizing before going to work for the NEA and the Tennessee Education Association, where I represented teachers up and down the state and a lot of rural communities, bargaining contracts, organizing to grow our membership. And then I joined the staff of Labor Notes as a labor educator and writer, and helped to support reform caucuses in unions around the country, especially the UAW. So I helped to support the founding of Unite All Workers for Democracy, or UAWD, which is a reform caucus that was formed in the wake of not only decades of concessionary contracts at the UAW, but also a really historic and awful corruption scandal that shook the upper leadership, leading to over a dozen union officials going to prison, including 2 of the last 4 UAW presidents. So I helped get that kind of grouping kind of off the ground, teaching them how to organize, teaching them how to expand their membership. And then I actually got pulled into a different reform effort, which is at the News Guild of New York, where a group of reformers ran a slate and took over that union. It's the flagship local of the News Guild, representing some of the most prominent journalists in the country at the New York Times and Reuters and places like that. And their goal was to turn it, into a militant fighting, union, going back to its old roots in the CIO. So they brought me in as their field director, where I oversaw collective bargaining and contract enforcement and strikes. I think my first year on staff at the News Guild, we ran more strikes that year than we had in the last 30 years combined. In part because it was explosive growth happening in media. So the organizing director there, Nastrin, is amazing. The organizing director at the News Guild International, Stephanie Basile, is one of the best I've ever met. And they were capable of organizing just hundreds and hundreds of workers over a very short period of time across dozens and dozens of shops. So when I first came into the News Guild, I was actually overseeing, I think at that point in time, more than 36 first contracts, which is a really intense problem. It's a good problem to have, but it's an intense one. And that kind of exponential growth was continuing the whole time I was there. But that reform leadership was really serious about rebuilding their union and about the kinds of programs and education that we needed to have with the membership in order to get them to be able to, when you have scale like that happening, you can't staff your way out of the problem. You've got to be able to train workers to be able to lead their own tables, to be able to lead their own strikes, think about how you're supporting them and growing their own capacity. So that's what we were really focused on. So I wasn't paying much attention to what was going on in the UAW when I was at the News Guild. And what ended up happening is that the UAW entered into a consent decree with the federal court, which means that there was a legal agreement between the union and a federal court judge about how the union had to restructure itself in the wake of the corruption scandals that were rocking it. And what they agreed to was to move towards a one-member, one-vote direct election system for the top leadership of the union. So in the past, the president, the secretary-treasurer, the vice president would all be elected by the delegate system, where delegates elected at the locals would go to a national convention every 4 years. It was a huge ordeal. And they would decide on how these, and who would run, and who would be elected to these top positions. And that entire system had been tightly controlled by the administration caucus, which was for over 70 years kind of the ruling party in the UAW. Call it a one-member state, So founded by Walter Reuther, it really expelled dissidents at his point in time, and then that continued on to the current day. And they really controlled the delegate system. And so moving to one member, one vote was a huge ordeal. But I'll be frank, I didn't think that, anybody would still win against the administration caucus because of the reach that, we assumed that they had in the membership. And I think it's just a great testament to you can't underestimate where workers are in this moment and how angry they were about the concessions they had seen and about the corruption that had happened. And so UAWD, that small caucus, ended up forming a slate, the Members United slate, where they had 9 candidates that they had for different positions, and 7 of them won in the first round of the elections outright. And 2 of them went to a runoff, including Sean Fain.
Yeah.
And I didn't know Sean at the time. I was blown away when I saw this news. I mean, I was just totally shocked. It was pretty incredible. But I knew the folks at UAWD, and they knew me, and we had a lot of trust with each other. And they knew that if Sean won, they thought he was going to need a plan for when, how to hit the ground running, especially because the big 3 contract negotiations were just a few months out at that point. So they reached out to me. They asked if I'd be interested in being his transition team manager. And I said, I'm interested. I'd like to meet him and talk to him, make sure that, we're aligned and, he thinks it's a good fit. I think it's a good fit. So I flew out to Detroit over a weekend, and I sat down with him at his kitchen table and talked to him. And it became immediately evident that to say Sean despises corporate America, I think is putting it too lightly. I mean, he is, like me, I think, driven by a place of rage at the injustices in the world, and in particular his experience in the auto industry, which is since the 2008 Great Recession, these companies have made billions of dollars in profits. We've actually found, between 2013 and 2023, they had made $250 billion collectively in profits. That's $250 billion. I can't even wrap my mind around that much money. And auto workers during that period of time had seen their wages, basically stagnate or go backwards due to inflation. They'd seen their benefits be cut. They'd seen tiers be instituted in the workplace. So he was beyond angry with the companies, and he was also obviously angry at the leadership of the UAW for allowing that to happen, right? And not only for allowing it, but enabling it by being in bed in some cases. That's why some of them went to prison, is because they were essentially receiving bribes from the auto industry. So I immediately was like, this guy's the real deal. I'm in. He was in with me. So I moved out to Detroit with my wife and my dog, and helped him to put together a plan. We thought the runoff was only going to be like 3 weeks, but it ended up lasting 3 months, which was just eating into the amount of time that we had, to think about like any sort of change that you need to get in place in order to bargain those big 3 contracts. But we used that time, to put together, I think, a pretty good plan. Right.
So one of the constraints you were under was you had to win the runoff.
Yeah.
Then you had to figure out what you were working with in running, a decent-sized union, but also a strategically important union for labor, and a historically very significant union for labor. And you had to do all that even at the same time as you had to start prepping for the most important contract negotiations for your union.
Yeah.
So what was the time window that you had before the contract expired?
So we won the runoff on March 30th, and the contracts expired on September 14th.
Right. So you had 6 months.
You had 6 months. Yeah.
So what kind of reach did you have through the people you knew, which were in the Reform Caucus, to the rank and file workers in the shops that were going to be covered by the contract? Do you have a lot of reach, or were you starting from scratch in a lot of shops?
It was starting from scratch in a lot of shops.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, the caucus, it's not Teamsters for Democratic Union that has been around for decades, right? And it's built, not only like a deep base among the rank and file, but leadership in locals across the country, right? UAWD was fledgling, and again, which is why it was so shocking when they won. And it, I think, was a reflection of where the UAW members were at the time. But we were thinking about it in those terms, like, okay, we know the members are as angry as Sean is. Sean is an avatar for them, and so thinking about that going into the negotiations was great. Well, what we need to do is we need to hold up a mirror to them, to say, like, you have every right to be angry, and the companies can absolutely afford it, and you are going to be the one who's in the driver's seat now to help us win it. And then we have to think about how we're going to go into the UAW and build a coalition of the willing among staff and leadership to help us make that possible.
So, right. I mean, that's quite a challenge.
Huge.
So what was the conversation like with local leaders and so on in the shops that were going to potentially go on strike, right? What was that like?
Yeah, all of this was very difficult. So we had to do 2 things kind of simultaneously. Is you're trying to build from the bottom up, and you're trying to reform from the top down. And for better or worse, because Sean was the president and the slate won the executive board, or supermajority of it, we were more or less a top-down reform effort, right?
Yeah.
And so the first thing we did was to say, okay, we have a plan, and we have to be able to execute that plan at all levels very clearly, right? So building consensus with that executive board was very, important, in part because getting access to locals is actually not an easy thing, even when you were the president, right? So after the election, everybody's still feeling very raw about the election, and most of those local leaders were members of the administration caucus, right?
Sure.
And so, and just to back this up a little bit, the first question for any reformer who's elected to run an international union is going to be, do I clean house, right?
Right.
And some decide to, there was very famously like a little bit more of a termination spree at the Teamsters than at the UAW. And Sean decided not to go in that direction because of how divided he saw that the union was, right? He only won the runoff by a few hundred votes, right? And the day after he was sworn in, he actually had to run the Special Bargaining Convention, which is this massive convention every 4 years in the UAW. It's all leadership from the locals around the country to set the bargaining agenda for the union overall, but also for the big three negotiations. And it was rough. It was very rough. It was very evident that there was a lot of hard feelings coming out of the election. And so the first question is how do we bring everybody together to be united enough even to get them on board with the idea of running a national contract campaign, which the UAW had never done before, which is what we were hoping to accomplish. So starting with that international board leadership was really important because they could help us build those relationships with local leaders that we didn't have previously. And I'll just give a shout out to Chuck Browning as a great example of this. Chuck Browning, ran against Sean, on the Curry slate. He was the vice president over Ford. And at that convention, he immediately used that opportunity to speak up and be like, this is our president. We're going to war. We're going to unite behind him. He's going to unite by us. And we're going to all get our spears pointed in the same direction. And that started to happen, right? So that created openings for us in the Ford department among Ford local leaders to start having conversations and to start thinking about how to roll this out. But it was in stages, and again, over a short period of time. And there was a lot of tensions and there was a lot of conflict, and it wasn't seamless, is what I would say.
So, I'm just, there are a lot of discussions amongst, the labor press and amongst labor scholars about, the labor movement needs to do this, the labor movement needs to do that. There's not so much about dealing with the reality of these organizations, right?
Yeah.
And so you discussed this in a piece that you wrote for Jacobin, 4 Lessons from UAW's Turn Toward Class Struggle. And I was really interested in that because you actually are grappling with some of these questions. Like, the labor movement can't be renewed unless we deal with the institutions that we have, right?
That's right.
So you and Sean and the others were all of a sudden confronted with the reality of that. And the good news is, whatever you did, you came out of it with a national contract campaign at the big three automakers. Clearly a very successful action. The stand-up strike won real gains. It dealt with a lot of issues in those contracts, which have been negotiated by people that were cutting deals behind the backs of the members. And in some ways really put the union back on the path to being a workers' organization rather than an institution which is just supposed to profit off of labor employment relations or whatever. But I'm still curious about what that conversation was like. Can you give me an example of a conversation with a local leader where they moved from being totally oppositional to, nope, this is what we have to do?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple. I don't want to name his name, but there was a regional director who was adamantly opposed to working with us, right? Which meant that he actually explicitly told the president's office that none of our staff could come into his region or visit any of the locals there, right? Yeah. And he was declaring kind of war on us. Yeah. And trying to get a contract campaign up off the ground, right? So we had prioritized, the organizing department as one of the departments that we really had to dig into, because if we're going to mobilize members like we've never done before, we need organizers to go out into the field and to teach them how to do things like run a practice picket, which no one had ever done before, right? And so he said, no, you can't send your organizers into my region. Well, his region happened to have one of the biggest and most profitable and most important assembly plants in the country. And so, but the local leader wanted to be a part of this and was getting angry at him for blocking us from being able to have access. And he said, well, I'm just going to run a practice picket on my own. But of course, he didn't have any guidance from us on how to do this. And what they ended up doing was actually doing the practice picket during work time in the plant and shutting down production, which is not great legally. Right. I think it's great from a campaign perspective because I want the employer to see how ready our members were to throw down on this. But it created all of a sudden, the regional director's calling me and freaking out, and like I'm like laughing, and like this is amazing, like what's going, but what ended up coming out of that was like we got to build a relationship with that local president. Kind of had to go around people at times, right? You just have to, but also trying to do it in a way that wasn't making things worse, right? My goal was to build a relationship with that regional director, and now they're one of the most diehard Sean, fans on Sean Slate now, like completely sees what we were, like after they got through it. The other thing I highly just recommend to people is winning.
Right.
You win and like it changes hearts and minds, it turns out. Like people are like, oh, you knew what you were doing. This is amazing. I actually want to be a part of this now. And I think that was a part of like what we saw at the sea change with the folks that ran against us on the opposite slate is after we got through the big three strike and they saw what we won, they were like, okay, I'm on board with the program now. But the other kind of flip version of that was there was a guy at a Kentucky truck plant who was a leader there and was very much on the, supporting the Curry slate, was very upset after Sean won. And, Chuck Browning got him to flip. Right, so because Chuck was the vice president over Ford, deeply, deeply respected among Ford workers, and he went and met with those leadership and was like, "No, like he's the president, and we're gonna win, we're gonna do something different, and we need to." He really believed in it. So by building those bridges, sometimes with other leaders, we were capable of like getting local leaders on the ground to flip, and sometimes we had to go around them and get local leaders to help put pressure on up. But it was a messy process.
The point about winning, I think, is essential. I think, lots of reform efforts realize pretty quickly that if they deliver for their members, lots of other things become possible. Mm-hmm. But if you're asking members to do things like raise dues on themselves to fund organizing, but you can't get their contract taken care of, like it's just never going to happen.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
One local leader that we work with a lot calls it and says, people have to know they're going to get their stuff. Mm-hmm. If they know that, then they're going to be down for a lot of other things, right? Mm-hmm. But it's so routine that unions don't take care of the basic part before trying to do other more ambitious things, assuming they're going to try and do ambitious things at all. Or people are forced to do it without their members, right? Yeah. That's a really, really interesting circumstance. And so the stand-up strike ends up being hugely successful and probably transforms Sean's status, not just there, but throughout the union, correct?
Absolutely. Overnight, he becomes a sensation. Even while the strike was happening, like getting Sean to go to these plants and members believing for the first time that their union was fighting for them, right? And then after we won the contract, again, I think auto workers, some of them rightfully were like, I should have gotten even more. The contract is worth, the last 4 contracts combined, but have you seen how well the companies have been doing? And I don't begrudge anyone for having that feeling. I think it's good. Again, I hope the employers were listening. But it really did. We went to so many local rollout meetings after the stand-up strike, and to hear so many workers and members take the floor just to say how proud they are in their union once again after the decades of concessions, after seeing all of these leaders go to prison, it was really moving and really powerful.
Yeah. So, winning the stand-up strike, get people their stuff, allows you to do other things. Mm-hmm. My interpretation of the UAW over the years is that it's had 2 strategic requirements to survive as a union. One is organize the transplants. So these are foreign manufacturers that are operating plants in the United States, which until very recently the UAW had never been able to crack.
That's right.
And the other is to organize the suppliers. So the big 3 spun off their auto parts supply operation so they could squeeze the suppliers and put all the low margins down on those businesses.
That's right.
While keeping the high margins at the assembly plants, right? And I remember when I was organizing in West Virginia, running into Unite organizers that were organizing parts plants and sort of asking them doesn't the UAW organize that? And they're like, nope. And they were just kind of MIA, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's one of the main strategic challenges, and I guess the other one is always funding whatever it takes to do that. So if those are sort of the strategic challenges, and tell me if I'm missing any. Am I missing any of the strategic challenges?
I think there's a couple that I would add to that. One is you have to take on the free trade regime. As long as employers can pit workers across borders against each other, right? Mm-hmm. In every organizing drive, it always comes up. They say, we're going to close the plant. We're going to move it to Mexico. Sure. And it's a legitimate threat. It is an actual genuine threat We lost something like 5 million jobs, 9,000 plants over, since the 90s. It's been devastating to the Midwest, obviously, now famously called the Rust Belt for that purpose. But it harms the contracts in the way that they come and ask for concessions and whipsaw, the plants against each other. So thinking politically about the days of just cozying up to Democrats because they're better than Republicans is over, right? I mean, Sean made that abundantly clear coming in. So having a totally different orientation towards politics to say that we have to have a vision that we're fighting for that is thinking about taking on the employer class and ending free trade, which is a very complicated, hard, and difficult conversation to have. It had to be a piece of it. And, to your point too, is just the bargaining that we did at the Big Three couldn't just be limited to the Big Three. We had to change how we were bargaining all across the union so that way we were winning stellar contracts that could drive the organizing that needs to happen in part suppliers and, in the Southern auto industry.
Okay, so free trade regime also. We now have a political environment where free trade is very much under attack, although not because of Democrats allied with unions to limit multinational corporations.
And maybe not for the best reasons either.
Right. Yeah. But it is one that was always part of the campaigning in the Rust Belt for
That's right.
Republicans, right?
Yeah.
With Trump at the head of the party. So those are the sort of parameters of, in addition to the dealing with the internal organizational problems of the UAW.
As if that wasn't enough,
Right. Which
we're just going to reorient the global economy.
Right.
Yeah.
You have these other key strategic challenges.
Yeah.
How did you and the administration set about to address those key challenges?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of it is, sometimes we don't always get to choose the campaign. Sometimes the campaign chooses us. So when it came to organizing, the transplants, the foreign-owned manufacturers in the South, this wild thing. I'll never forget this. So we're in the final stages of the Big Three negotiations and the stand-up strike. We're trying to land the deal. We're bleary-eyed, on 8 hours of sleep a week. And the IT department comes into a meeting and they're like, "We just need you to know something. Thousands of workers are signing union authorization cards around the country right now." And we were like, "What? What do you mean?" And they were like, "Well, workers at Honda and Hyundai, and Mercedes, they have found links to union authorization card signups online from campaigns that were run years ago, and they're sharing it all over Facebook." And so we were like, "What?" So we started to dig into this, and we were seeing hundreds and hundreds of cards being signed, which immediately leads to the question of who's doing that in the shops. Like there's a leadership identification we could be doing, and all these people, we should be getting into this and figuring all this out. But we were trying to win a strike at that point in time, didn't have the capacity. We were like, okay, but this is telling us that the auto industry is moving into a hot shop scenario, right? And so what we ended up doing was trying to figure out, right after the strike ended, how do we translate our strike victory immediately into new organizing? And how do we do it, given one of the major constraints that we had was the staffing problems in the organizing department, right? And
so tell me about what the organizing department looked like when you arrived.
Oh, man. So the first week I go to work at the UAW, the first thing I learn is that the organizing department is referred to as the dumping ground. So that was the place, if you wanted to get, your niece a job, your cousin a job, and you wanted to hide them somewhere, you put them in the organizing department. Or, and this is just as bad, if you ticked off a leader enough, they would say, "I'm sending you to organize the South." So organizing the South, rather than being the highest calling, right, and rather than the organizing department being the beating heart of the union, this is the place where they just shove people, right? So we came in, we learned that there were people who had worked in that department for over a decade, in some cases, that were organizers that entire time who had never been through a single NLRB election. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Just to give you again, how dysfunctional things were and how siloed all these departments were and how little communication was happening and the lack of coordinated plans across the union. We ran and won within the first few months of being in office a organizing drive at Yanfeng, which is a parts supplier in Missouri. And it was a really incredible campaign, super nasty boss fight. And we won it and feeling great about it. And I was in a meeting with the research department leadership at that time, and they were like, "Well, Chris, we actually have a neutrality agreement with Yanfeng." And I was like, "What?" And they were like, "Yeah, we've had one for a decade, and nobody's ever asked us about it." And I asked the organizing department, they were like, "Nobody knew." And now, again, I'm not saying Yanfeng would have like abided by the neutrality agreement, but the fact that nobody even knew. I mean, so it's hard to like express the dysfunction that existed in the union at that point in time, right? And how the organizing department was a big piece of that. So we're thinking about like, okay, you've got a national hot shop, in the auto industry. What are we going to do? Well, there is one shining star, like a big one in the UAW, which is the higher ed organizers. I mean, they are incredible. They're super committed. They've developed their own system for how to organize higher ed at scale. And I talk about this in pieces, but like, over a 2-year period.
Well, let's mention the piece. Is this learning from the UAW's national organizing?
That's right.
Push? Yeah.
Yeah.
So where you're talking about structure versus momentum.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So they have developed a model that's highly efficient and highly effective that I think breaks some of the rules of structure-based organizing. And between a 2-year period that I looked at, they organized over 30,000 workers, and they won their campaigns. I mean, like the yes votes are over 90% every time. I mean, like they're just blowing it out of the water. Now, I think when I say it's different from a structure-based organizing model in some ways, I would be very clear about this. So structure-based organizing is a very methodical, very cautious approach to organizing that's also very staff-intensive, where you typically want one staff organizer for every 100 workers, and you go in, you build committees in secret, and then you escalate over time. And what you want is to build towards supermajority public actions, right? You don't want just someone verbally saying, I support the union,
Yep.
or just signing a card that's a personal action, right? Because what often happens is like the boss builds a campaign that ratchets up the tension in a workplace, and what they tell the workers is just tell the organizer whatever they want to hear. Make them go away, right? So what you want to know is that this person is actually going to be a yes vote, and the best way to demonstrate that is by getting them to do things in front of the boss together collectively, right? And so building towards that is very, very difficult. It's a super challenging thing to do. And what they've done is, because their model, they don't have really super intensive boss fights for the most part. They're in areas of the country that are primarily blue, so you're not having like in Mercedes and Alabama, where you have what I call the trifecta of anti-unionism, where you have the state against you, like the governor's literally having press conferences saying don't organize, right? You have the boss against you in the most hostile environment possible, and then you have these out-of-state, corporate-funded, chamber-backed groups that are coming in and just doing a massive air war against you in the community, right? So they don't have to face any of that, which is great, right? And so their model is very lean. They'll have one staff organizer working on like 4 campaigns across universities involving tens of thousands of workers, and they'll just stage them out, and they'll win them over a period of time, right? And they do it by recruiting, what they call leaders. And, in the structure-based model, a leader is very specific. A leader has followers, and you have to demonstrate that over and over and over again, right? Mm-hmm. In the higher ed model, it's much more of an activist-based. It's like people who are coming in are willing to go through a leadership training, who are willing to take responsibility, and then what they're like really focused on is coverage, right? So how much coverage you have in there. And because they see other workers winning in all these universities across the country, they have a high belief that they can win if they just follow, this model. And so I don't think like some structure-based organizers would look at what higher ed's doing. They'd be like, well, their leadership identification is not the same, and they're not doing public structure tests. And they'd be like, that's bad organizing. And I would say it's absolutely not. It's highly efficient, highly effective. And if you were to do the structure-based model, you would have less victories over time because you'd be doing the super intensive, highly methodical, super cautious approach. So we saw what they were doing. And Jonah and I had a lot of background in thinking about momentum models of organizing. And, I think that this is like strangely something that like is not well understood even among many organizers, is that there are different models of organizing, and that organizing always has a context, right? So the structure-based model comes out of labor being in a highly defensive position, of employers having such overwhelming power, right, that you have to be that methodical and you have to be that careful. But not all contexts are like that, right, that people are organizing in. And so the momentum model is based on how social movements are actually organized, right? And so when I think about like a prime example of the differences between these, I think about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, right, which would like embed in a community, and they would like do voter registration drives, and they would sign people up, and they would like get churches and different groups and the leadership to be identified there to form a coalition. And that was totally different from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference would be like, we're going to have a mass action in Birmingham, Alabama, because we think Bull Connor is going to act a fool, and we're going to get all the press there, and this is going to create a massive, massive moment where everyone in society is going to be polarized, and they're going to have to pick a side. And what those moments do, those what they call the moments of the whirlwind in momentum organizing, is they create opportunities where people suddenly, who you don't have to just have like a super intensive organizing conversation with, are willing to jump into the fray. They're willing to get involved, right? An example in my lifetime, for example, is Occupy, right? The Occupy movement. You see people pitching tents. If you had come to me and said, Chris, we're going to pitch tents in Zuccotti Park and start a national movement against wealth inequality in this country, I would have laughed in your face because I was a diehard structure-based organizer at that period of time, right? But it worked. So what are we learning from that, right? So there is a model, there is a method to momentum organizing that looks at how social movements happen and how you can decentralize these structures and you can get to scale very quickly. So what we were thinking is like, okay, we have these higher ed organizers. We know we can't run structure-based organizing across 5 auto plants, much less 20, right, in the South. So can we try to blend these things? Can we put them together in a way that can actually get workers to see themselves as the primary agents for winning and create like a structured system for them to like scale up their campaigns over time, learn from each other, and see how far we get, and not predetermine what the outcome would be, right? So that's what we did. So we called it the 30, 50, 70 model. So the idea was you get to 30% of your coworkers on cards. We go public with your campaign, which again is breaking a lot of rules in structure-based organizing. At 50%, Sean comes down, we have a massive rally. And at 70%, we're going to ask for recognition and file for an election, right? And the goal was to get workers like to hit these benchmarks so they could see each other doing it, get excited about it, drive that momentum. And also we created spaces every other week where we had them joining each other digitally over Zoom, like talking to each other, sharing out how they're having conversations, how they were doing things like, it's really important to have someone on your organizing committee who, you know, drives a tugger, you know, like something that helps like move the parts around the plant because they have access to everybody, right? So they could figure out, we could like map the plant together and we could talk about who we think is the leader in the different lines and who can go and talk to them. So they were having these kinds of really rich conversations about how to very quickly try to scale up their campaigns. And what we saw is we launched this campaign in November. We had 3,000 people signed up on cards just organically at that point. And very quickly, I think by January, we had 10,000 signed up, and Volkswagen was already way in the lead, right? Because they had already had campaigns previously, they had had leadership, you know, had been tested there previously, and they had, you know, were accustomed to the idea of like, oh yeah, we're going to run a campaign. So Volkswagen very quickly became, you know, the lead on nationally on where we were thinking that we were going to be able to break through, right? And the goal of 30, 50, 70 for us as well is to say, okay, we don't have a lot of staff with a lot of experience in organizing, but as you hit these benchmarks, we will put more staff on those campaigns. So there were staff spread everywhere, but then we would start to concentrate it as the campaign scaled up. So as Volkswagen got further and further along, we added more and more higher ed organizers to there. And I should just really shout out Carla Villanueva, who is the higher ed organizer that was the lead on the ground there. Absolutely amazing organizer. She killed it, like just did such an incredible job with those workers. And then went on to actually win the campaign at Bossk in Kentucky, the battery plant there, which was also a really tough fight. But you know, so we were building all of that. And we were successful. It was the first, you know, we won 3-1. It was really incredible. You know, breakthrough moment, the first, you know, transplant to be organized in the South.
So, well, I mean, nobody can look at that and not think of it as a very important strategic victory for labor, which we should also add was not just an election victory, because now there's a contract.
That's right.
And we often lose track of the fact that some of these very important election victories do not result in contracts, right? So there's now a contract at the Volkswagen Chattanooga plant, right?
Yeah, ratified by 96% of the membership. Yeah, it's a stellar first contract, 20% wage increases over 4 years. You know, job protections. I mean, the job protections are really key for a place like that because the employers, again, constantly saber rattling about closing. I think it's very clear that Volkswagen, you know, wants access to this market, and that's going to be like a really important plan to do it in the future. Yeah. You know, so it's going to be I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee originally, and so, you know, I have friends who worked that I went to middle school with. And literally, it's a life-changing contract. I mean, like it's hard to state, like if you are a blue-collar worker in the South, how different your life is going to be now that you have that contract.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's going to change the environment for labor relations across at least the Mid-South.
Ruth or willing. Yeah.
Ruth or willing. So I'm going to take a moment to pause here to remind people if they are watching online. We'll take some questions from you for Chris starting at about 10:50, so in about 17 minutes. In the meantime, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them and Chris will answer your questions. Okay. So the structure versus momentum discussion from your piece, that sparked a lot of discussion, some controversy. You know, my own perspective on this is that if you think there's a one-size-fit-all approach to organizing, you're probably just flat out wrong.
Yeah.
If you're not viewing these things as tools for a job, you're probably making mistakes.
That's right. Yeah.
The other problem I sort of see with this is it focuses all of our attention on tactics, right? There's a lot of advocacy for tactics in the sort of labor discussion, laborist press, and so on like that. Very much at the expense of strategic discussions, which are pretty hard to find. But this is another issue that you've taken up in your writing. Okay, so for example, and unions are going to die unless something big changes soon, right? You're turning to strategic questions. Now, if you don't have tactics to execute strategy, doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
I tend to think of the tactics as providing a doctrine, especially in places that don't have much of one. But, these are debates that were also happening in the 90s, right? They were happening in unions that I was in. But the strategic questions often fall by the wayside. So when we think about things like structure or structure-based approaches to organizing versus momentum-based approaches to organizing, one of the things that you make clear is that there are actual strategic consequences for these choices, right?
Yeah.
So one consequence is how many staff organizers do you have to organize a facility?
Yeah.
Right? Well, if you're doing it with 1/4 the number of staff on a momentum-based campaign, you've allowed many other organizing campaigns to take off with the same number of staff, or you're actually getting a lot more done with a lot less. So in a report that we issued, called Beyond the LRB, we're doing just back of the napkin math. If it costs $5,000 to organize a worker, even if it costs significantly less than that, reversing labor's decline is going to cost $1 billion a year.
Yeah.
Now, unions do have that money. They generally don't spend it on organizing, right? So, and this is actually another sort of UAW question. So, very big splash when UAW said they were going to spend $40 million a year on organizing, right? And I'd be curious about a little bit about the background of that and your thinking on that. And that's significantly more than a fair number of unions, right? On the other hand, if the task is $1 billion,
Right.
that's not very much.
Right.
Right. Now, the UAW has resources in a strike fund, but it's also not the biggest union in the country. There are probably more dues coming in organizations like the IBT or SEIU or AFSCME and unions like that. The shift, the deindustrialization of the United States has impacted industrial unions, obviously. But how do you see the connection between these choices and the strategic task for labor?
That's a big question. I think one of the important things you're talking about is that we're all operating under constraints, right? So there's the financial constraints, whatever those might be. There's the organizational constraints, right? Do you even have the level of talented, experienced staff that are necessary, right? And if part of the goal is to say we have to get to scale, right? And like the piece that you mentioned, one of the things I look at is just what are the BLS projections for job growth, in the economy over the next 10 years? Now, again, they've been blown out of the water by Trump, but just looking at that, even on the best years that all these people are lauding the labor movement for our win rate in the last 3 or 4 years, which has been great, winning over 3/4 of the drives that we take to an election. But that's because we're only taking drives to an election if we feel highly confident that they're going to win, and they're probably very small units, and to your point, maybe not in strategic sectors, right? So maybe a lot of nonprofits, maybe a lot, whatever the case may be. So
well, and there's a difference. There's strategic sectors, but there's also strategic consequence. So organizing a higher ed unit, I would argue, is not particularly strategic for labor in the sense of that those are core industries that you need to rebuild the labor movement. But it is strategic because the scale of it is such that it actually changes the sort of resource profile of labor, right? You actually have a very big footprint in an important industry, and that's a lot of resources. And you've mentioned the resources that come from the higher ed organizing, how that filtered into helping win a victory in
the-
Chattanooga.
That's
right?
absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Well, it's also interesting, Region 6 is incredible. Mike Miller, the director of the UAW there, is incredible, very smart, very creative and thoughtful. They have a lot of higher ed, and what they also saw is, people graduate from university, and then they go to work, sometimes in really advanced technological, green new economy, employers that we want to organize, that we're actually very eager to organize. And so a lot of that organizing is paying dividends down the road in other ways too, right, to think about it. But all that to say is that, I just don't even see this conversation happening in the current labor movement. Like, that's really the really unfortunate thing. Like, I was very disappointed, the AFL tweeting out, this big celebration, 400,000 workers organized last year. I don't even know where they're getting their numbers from. I'm looking at the same numbers and I'm not seeing that. But also, we're at 5.9% density in the private sector.
Right.
Even if we were to double the amount of people organized in the private sector, we still wouldn't even have 80% or more of the employers out there would still be non-union. So what are we celebrating? Like, this should be a moment of really deep reflection in the labor movement to say, are we meeting the moment? Yeah. Especially when we know people have come through COVID, they've come through a highly inflationary event, right? Their lives they're struggling to get by. 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And, we talk about this a lot in the UAW. We hit peak 65 last year, right? So more people are turning 65 in this country than at any point in time, leading to a serious retirement crisis, right? Because people are retiring without any sort of financial security that they're going to need in order to survive. So given the situation that we're in, are we doing what we need to in order to be able to have the kind of power to execute a different kind of politics in this country? Or are we going to continue to see inequality skyrocket, climate change just move forward unimpeded, all these problems.
So thinking about the UAW's own effort to at least initially start resolving the problem, so clearly they had not been doing, there have been efforts in the past in the UAW to address this. Not every president went to jail.
Yeah.
Right? There were other people that tried to address this. But in general, the UAW lost control of the transplants, they lost control of the parts plants.
That's right.
And then Bain decides and announces to a great deal of fanfare $40 million a year on organizing.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that discussion in the UAW and how it went over with members and things like that?
Well, I think what's hard, right, is that if you have a lot of members out there that are like, I can't even get a grievance processed, and now you're going to spend all of this money on someone who's not even a member of my union, it does naturally lend itself to conflict, right, if not done correctly. So it was really important for us that we paired all of these things together as a holistic package for a vision for the UAW, right? So at that same board meeting where we approved the $40 million, we also approved the creation of the Department of Bargaining Strategies, right? So which I helped to create. And what it did was to say, we're going to take the stand-up model, which really just means high participation, deeply planned contract campaigns, to other sectors, right? And so the first thing we did out of the gate was to take it to Daimler, which is 7,000, workers making trucks in the South. And we worked with the leadership there. They were very eager coming out of the stand-up strike. People were raising their hand being like, help us, we want to do something different. And we helped them build an actual contract campaign for the first time that escalated over time, demonstrated to the company how serious we were about winning really ambitious demands. And they won a historic contract. Right, and we took this on the road, right? So we're working to try to scale up, train reps who, service these locals, train bargaining committees who had never been never been exposed to any of this stuff before, about how to do this. And we started to win better contracts all around the country. So that helps to soften the ground, right? To some of us, be like, okay, well, we're spending money on organizing, but also my contract is really good. I feel like a little bit more of that dues money can go there now, right? So I think it's just important to say is that you can't just focus on one of these things. You have to do all of them together, right? And that was a piece of it. And the other was, again, we paired it also with the idea of, a return to the idea of the UAW as the vanguard for the labor movement. And by that, what we meant is we are going to try to push the politics differently in the union, and no longer are we going to fixate on access politics, right? Which you write a check to a politician, you get in the room with them, yeah, great, but then what are they doing for us, right? And what we started to realize, too, is, picket lines became kind of weird photo ops for a lot of politicians. At first it was oh, we're showing power, we're getting somebody to a picket, which again, Joe Biden showing up to a picket line was actually incredible. The companies did not like that. It was the first time a sitting U.S. president ever went to a picket line during the stand-up strike. Very proud of that. But it also just became kind of the membership is yeah, all right, but you're doing this for you. What are you doing for me? And I think it's very clear is like we have to move, like we have to lead on our politics by leading on the issues that matter the most to people and drawing that line in the sand and forcing the politicians to cross over to our side, right? So thinking about how we were approaching all of these things all at once, I think was really important, and packaging them together, right? To say this is a different UAW, we're going in a different direction. And, you know, the organizing is another piece of that that ties into power. And so then we started to have a lot of conversations, you know, because when you organize in the South, you know, we really wanted to involve the other locals all around Volkswagen, right? So we got the Ford workers involved from Kentucky Truck Plant up there in Louisville. We got the GM workers involved from Spring Hill, Tennessee, which is two massive plants. And, you know, Mike, I'll just tell you this is a really funny story. So, like, we're at a mass meeting of Volkswagen workers in Chattanooga, and we've got Ford workers there and GM workers there and Sean there. And it was like two alien species kind of talking to each other about healthcare, because in the big three, you don't have premiums.
Right.
You don't have deductibles. You don't have copay. I mean, it is insane.
Cadillac health insurance.
I mean, like Cadillac, it's the lyric. I mean, it's the, like, I don't even know, you know, like, it's amazing insurance. And so folks are trying to struggle on the ground, like in Volkswagen, they're like what? Like, you know, like, so when they would use words like premium and deductibles, if you're a GM worker and you came with a GM, you have no idea what that even is.
Yeah.
So you're spending your entire time being like, so you pay every month for insurance before you even use it, and then you go to use it, and you have to, like, how does that make any sense? And there's you know, so it was just wild to see that happening. But it showed again, like, this is the standard that's been created in the auto industry through a union. And so when people did wrap their minds around, I mean, how revelatory that is to them, right?
Yeah.
You know, so we started to really involve more locals and more leaders. We did that again at Bosch, like getting the Louisville, local there to be involved in helping support that campaign. So this is a big change in the UAW, right, is helping locals to actually form organizing committees to support organizing drives at the employers in the areas that they exist in.
Yeah. So how much of this new sort of organizing effort is built around things like training member organizers as opposed to staff organizers, and how much of it is trying to develop new staff? I mean, I've known for a long time the higher ed stuff has helped solve the staff organizer problem in the UAW. Like, there are any number of former higher ed organizing committee members and activists and stuff like that that went on to become staffers in the UAW. But so how much of that, though, is also, are you trying to solve the problem through a member organizing program, things like that?
Yes. I mean, again, it's like all these problems are global, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, if you're taking from higher ed, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You know, the higher ed folks are like, well, then we need more organizing. You know, so like everybody's scrambling to get as much as they can of the pie, right? And I think, you know, one of the biggest challenges we have is, like, we have to have a model where we are scaling up expertise in organizing, right? So that we have to have really good leads who can lead staff, who can train members, right? And if you can't even get a lead, like the chain breaks down, right? So building that entire chain has to be done kind of holistically over time. Like, you have to find people who can actually lead a team, you know, who can train organizers, who can help them, like, unpack their conversations that they're having, help get them to a place where they are not only experts, but that they're capable of training others, right? And then have them oversee them and shadow them and mentor them as they are mentoring and shadowing others, right? And so that is not an easy thing to build overnight. And I'll just say, like, I mean, it was a little disappointing to me personally. Like, I didn't understand this. I thought after the stand-up strike, everybody in the labor movement and everybody on the left or whatever would want to come and work for the UAW, and that they would want to go organize the South. That is not the case. You tell people, like, you're going to work 10 days straight with 4 days off, and you're going to be focused in Alabama or South Carolina. Turns out folks are pretty comfortable where they are, and they don't want to, or, move to Detroit, So, like, it's really incumbent on us, and that just speaks to the fact that we have to build the member program, right? Just like higher ed has very successfully done, but we have to do it in manufacturing, and that is the key to the future.
So I just want to remind people that we will be taking questions in a couple minutes. So if you have a question, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I am going to keep asking questions. I think a lot of unions are trying to push organizing programs right now, and like one of the problems is that they're trying to hire staff lead organizers, and that's created a lot of competition.
Yeah.
There are not enough staff lead organizers right now.
That's right.
But it does, the unions that just say, well, then we're just going to train members to do it, it seems to be solving the problem. in a way that not all unions are doing. I mean, that ultimately the greatest resource that
That's right.
unions have, right, is their members. But that sort of goes to a different kind of union than the one the UAW was for a long time. Like then you're talking about a union not as a contract bargaining and servicing organization. You're talking about a workers' organization, which I think is what a lot of unions originally were.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of unions probably aren't. But that has to deal with existing local elected leadership. That has to deal with practices that are embedded in the union for many years. So you've talked about a few things that you tried to do. So your bargaining strategies department was one,
Mm-hmm.
and then another was running these campaigns, right?
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit more about the bargaining strategies part of it, and sort of how you use that as a tool to transform the sort of culture and practices of the union.
Yeah, I mean, so this is also key to organizing, because what we said is like bargaining and organizing are two legs that you walk on, right? Because when you win strong contracts, that inspires other people to want to organize, right? And so what you want to create is this virtuous cycle, right? Where you're winning strong contracts in a very public way, and you're building more organizing capacity in those locals that are winning it, and then you're translating that into opportunities to organize in the same sector or industry, right? And I think that that's been very hard to jumpstart in a lot of ways. Like in the UAW, like what we would saw is that we would win these really historic agreements, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to immediately translate that into new organizing. But that being said, like what we were capable of doing is through the Department of Bargaining Strategies is to demonstrate like where we were strongest in the union. So where we were capable of really, developing the strongest staff, getting really strong, incredible victories that set the standard for the industry.
Mm.
And then, hopefully, moving that forward into new organizing. But the staff, most of them had never experienced this. There's this problem in the UAW, and it's wild. Like, people think I'm making this up or I invented this. Like, when I came in, the way that we had educational materials that literally trained bargaining teams in what they called blackout bargaining. Like literally internally to the UAW, they describe it like that, which is just wild to me because it sounds like a pejorative term that you wouldn't even want to use. But there are people who saw this as the responsible way to bargain, was that you would agree to ground rules that totally hamstring you from talking to your membership. You go behind closed doors, and at some point, maybe the bargaining team, maybe a president, maybe a vice president, some bigwig comes in and just goes behind closed doors with management and comes out and says, here's your deal. And then they wonder why their contracts are getting voted down across the board, right? And so what we try to tell people is we saw this problem of contracts being voted down, and oftentimes they would call us in after it was voted down. So we became the fixers, right? So, we actually have an entire system for how we would totally come in after a contract's been voted down to get everybody moving in the same direction, because then the bargaining team is mad at the membership's mad at the bargaining team, nobody's talking about the employer anymore. And so we would come in and say, okay, we're going to build a high participation campaign now using this moment, and we're going to identify the most widely and deeply felt issues, and we're going to get the membership really involved, and we're going to drive this. And this stuff is off the table. But what was ideal, obviously, was to not be called down after the contract was voted down and all this bargaining history has already been laid and all this stuff is happening, but on the front end and working with people months out. So we started to identify the most strategic or the biggest or the most important contract campaigns that were coming up, again, because we have limited staff. The Department of Bargaining Strategy started with 2 people, right, on staff. And so we're having to go in and train the reps that are there, what other departments, build a whole team around it, and then, really work with them to develop a timeline and a plan. And I'll just say the idea of that, you should actually have a timeline and a plan was completely foreign to people. I mean, there are people who've been on staff there. I mean, some of them retired after this, and their entire experience on staff at the UAW, they never once were asked for a plan.
Yeah.
Which is wild, right,
Yeah.
to think about. So everybody's just being thrown into this stuff. So
especially given the big 3 contract negotiations. These are nationwide master contracts. These are immensely complicated contracts to negotiate, I'm sure.
A story I have is, so the UAW has this place called Black Lake. It's very special to the UAW. It's the educational resort in Upper Michigan, developed by Walter Reuther. And, so we had a pre-Big 3 bargaining retreat there with the other vice presidents and with all of these, department heads. And I will never forget, one of the most senior people there was chatting with another senior person, and they had been intimately involved in Big 3 negotiations going back decades. And they told Sean and I that this was the first planning meeting they'd ever been to for Big 3 negotiations. I mean, it was astonishing. Which again, but if you practice blackout bargaining, if the idea was we're not going to tell the members anything, we're not going to publicize what our demands are, and at some point the president just goes behind closed doors and cuts a deal with management, what plan do you need?
Right.
You know?
So we have a couple of questions here. A couple of them I think are very good. One which did not occur to me, but I actually think is a really good question. Which comes from a union member who wants to buy UAW-made vehicles. It says, it's been very frustrating to watch U.S. manufacturers place most of their bets on the short-term profits they make from eye-wateringly expensive gasoline-powered trucks and SUVs. Wow, he is not wrong, okay? And he concludes by saying, Ford and GM literally have no products for working-class families who want an affordable car or minivan. And if we think about sort of the history of American auto manufacturing, this is an inversion. He's talking about, we now have the sort of pre-CIO organization of the Ford Motor Company and GM and so on like that, where, whatever workers are being paid is not sufficient to make them a market for the products of the car companies, for the products that the car companies are making. So yeah, what do you have to say about that? I think that's a great question.
It's a great question. It speaks to, what economists are calling the K-shaped economy, right? Which is, you have an economy that's doing very well for the top 10% and very poorly for everyone else, right? Who's seeing their wages not go as far as they used to because of inflation. And the drive to price gouging is what we described a lot in the UAW during the stand-up strike. We talked a lot about how these companies knew that they could just pump up their margins by, increasing the cost of automobiles needlessly over a period of time. I will say, one of the shocking things to me, that people are talking now about how there are 50-year home loans, is that we're seeing the same thing with automobiles, right? There are now, you can get an 8-year car loan, which was unheard of in the industry. And so it is abundantly, take the F-150, it is an extraordinarily, popular truck, right, in the United States. We love our trucks. And, it's not cheap, right? And Ford, makes really good margins on those trucks. Yeah. And now, what was happening under the Biden administration is for the first time in my lifetime, we actually had an industrial policy in this country. Yeah. And he was moving us towards a green economy, in part by fixating on EVs, right, the electric vehicles, and moving us away from internal combustion engines, or what's called in the industry ICE. ICE is never a good thing in any acronym, it turns out. Yeah. And what we were doing was two things. The government was heavily subsidizing the production of batteries and electric vehicles, giving, basically guaranteeing profits for the companies even if they couldn't sell it, while at the same time punishing people for the production of ICE vehicles, making it extraordinarily expensive, right? So the idea was to move the market in that direction. Now, Trump came in and just ripped all that apart, right? So what you're seeing now is they're like, great, we're going to move right back to producing the biggest automobiles, the most expensive automobiles that we can, because the margins on them are so good, right? So the companies are making just money hand over fist by doing that. So there's enough of a consumer base out there right now, at the very least, for the companies to think that this is the most rational model for them to do. And I think it speaks to, again, the big three have largely said that they talk about non-union companies as being in competition with them, in terms of concessions when they go to the table to demand them, but they actually aren't, because they're different segments of the auto market, right? So the trucks, the SUVs, the CUVs, all that, the big three's got it on lockdown. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about sedans, when you're talking about those kinds of things, that's a highly competitive, low margin market that's that's where the foreign transplants really operate, right? So the question is, are those foreign transplants eventually over time, we believe they are, right, are going to eat in more and more into the big three's market, and the big three is not doing the inverse, right?
Well, and I mean, it seems like one thing that's always going to be driving this is the emphasis on shareholder returns. Yep. Right? Rather than things like a market and serving a customer base. So, Toyota clearly has a far more elaborate product line. And they're competing in areas that the American companies just aren't anymore. Mm-hmm. And their market share goes up, right? And ultimately that market share is going to be market power. So playing a niche game seems problematic. We have another question, which I would like to ask before we finish up. This comes from Ben Fong, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Work and Democracy. Blue sky question. How would you spend $100 million to revitalize the labor movement?
Oh, man. Well, I'd still say $100 million is a tenth of what we need, right? I mean, so that's a great question, though.
It's better than nothing, though.
It's better than nothing. I'll take it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Man, I think that the first step, honestly, and it's one of the most important ones, and it's not happening, is you need to get people in a room, like, to talk about this. What are the employers that have to be taken down, right? That we really need to think about the role that they play in the American and global economy, and where we have the opportunity to fundamentally shift the balance of power in society. I mean, so I think that this is again, really good organizers. You move folks in a campaign. You start with why they're angry, right? You start with what's happening on the job. You identified widely and commonly, or widely and deeply felt issues in the workplace. But where you want to end up is getting everyday working people to a place where they realize, what I'm actually doing is I'm building an organization that's capable of shifting the balance of power between us and our employer, and between us and the employer class, right? We have to get to a place where we're thinking about, to your point, bigger picture strategy about where are we going to focus our time and attention and limited resources in a way that is going to help us to scale and to help us to have more power tomorrow than we started with today, so that way we can do more things, right? And those conversations I just don't feel like are happening in the labor movement, unfortunately. Not in enough places.
Definitely not enough places. It's interesting where they come up, I think, but it's been an issue for sure, and it's actually related to another question, which is the question about the dependence of labor on the Democrats. Now, labor is a big tent. Not all unions are aligned with Democrats, but there's certainly been an idea about union power, which rests on two things. One is labor law, and the other is the Democratic Party. Labor law is increasingly not a thing. The Democratic Party, I would argue, hasn't really served working people's interests for many decades now. That their main interlocutor is professionals. And certainly working people seem to recognize that because they're voting for Democrats less and less all the time. But this person is also suggesting another approach, not that they necessarily want it to happen, but we've certainly seen the Teamsters and the Teamsters president, Sean O'Brien, take a different approach, which was very much to, I think people overemphasize how much he was courting Republicans, but he was putting the endorsement of the Teamsters in play and saying, you need to win the endorsement of the Teamsters to the Democrats and the Republicans in the last presidential election cycle. What do you think of that as an approach to breaking this dependence?
Well, I would say we took a different approach, obviously, in the UAW,
Sure.
right? I mean,
Well, everybody did.
That's very true. That's very true. I think the Teamsters get. I think that there's a problem, on the left where people attack them without dealing with they're existing in reality, and I think you can come to different conclusions about how to deal with reality, right?
That's right.
But it's very clear that many labor leaders have decided in this country that we're going to deal with the reality, which is the overwhelming power of the federal government to determine our futures, by just cozying up to the people that we think are the best grouping of them, right? I think that given the fact that that hasn't worked through the Democrats, one tack is to say, well, maybe we should figure out a way to build a bigger coalition or a bigger tent, and maybe there are people in the Republican Party. Hawley has put forward his mini PRO Act, right, and the idea of arbitration for first contracts, because we don't know how many of them don't end up actually, many workers that win their union can't even, whether they get a first contract or not. It could be as low as 50%, and the ones that do take over 500 days or more, right? So the idea of forcing arbitration on that, okay, that's not a bad idea legislatively. Whether he can get it done, I don't know. But the Teamsters are at least recognizing there are some people in the Republican Party. Now, we obviously at the UAW were saying, no, we're not going to do that. That's not the direction that we're going in. What we decided is that what we need to do is we need to try to build up what we see as working class champions in the Democratic Party, right? So people who we believe are actually connected, rooted in, and fighting for labor, right? So Zoran Mamdani is a great example of that. We were the first union to come out of the gate to endorse him. Absolutely transformational kind of politician, right? We need more of those around the country. He's existing in a context, though, where the Democrat is the obvious, party vehicle, right, to move those politics in New York City. That is not true everywhere. So in other parts of the country, especially in deep red states, we think that maybe the better thing to do is to focus on independence. Who are people who can run on labor's issues without getting, basically stigmatized by the Democratic Party brand, but actually connecting with voters around the things that we know that they actually care about, right? Which is their everyday lives.
Well, so that raises a really important question, because people tend to think about politics in terms of red and blue, and they think about it as a team sport, Democrat, Republican. The UAW has to have a relatively national profile.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with a organizer of the United Postal Workers, and he's like, hey, you need to have a national strategy to rebuild labor. We're the only union that's in every zip code in America. I'm like, it's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Like, they have to deal with the reality of everywhere, right? And a lot of unions don't, because the labor movement has basically become a New York, California operation.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And however much you can organize in New York and California, revival only comes when you can organize Indiana or Tennessee.
That's right.
But so if you're thinking about it in terms of red and blue, you're probably missing lots and lots of other dynamics that are going on in these states. And so one question, which I think people around Jacobin, people in the labor movement are constantly trying to grapple with, is there a working class politics out there that's not being reflected in these, what are often quite, more or less one-party districts and states?
That's right.
And I'll throw one thing out. I remember we studied ballot initiative politics a lot at the Center for Working Democracy. When Missouri voted to overturn a right-to-work law by ballot initiative, the citizens of Missouri voted to overturn a right-to-work law that the legislature had passed by ballot initiative. And you're sort of looking at that and you're going, what was that about? There's not much of a labor movement in Missouri, right? You don't think of it as a militantly pro-worker state. It's a pretty solidly red state, and here are the citizens just like chucking out a law that's been passed by the people that they elected. You see stuff like that, and you start wondering, well, is there a working class politics? And we know that there are lots of people who will say that, people like Mamdani in New York City. But our concern is Tennessee, Missouri, right, Indiana, states like that. What do you think about the reality of the working class politics in those
I would just
states?
say Sean himself is a Gen X electrician from Kokomo, Indiana.
Right.
It's not the home of cornbread and communism, right? It's it's a deep red state, with it, and that's a deep red area, and he's really embedded there, but he resonates, right? Like it's very clear that he is a product of his environment, but he's capable of reflecting back to the environment a different kind of politics, right?
Yeah.
One that's more feisty and angry and independent. And punching up, which is the most important piece, and emphasizing the unity that we need at the bottom to be able to do that effectively, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we were really excited about Dan Osborne and his campaign running as an independent. I think there are really great candidates at the Grand Plattner. I think people who I think are demonstrating that you can run on these kinds of politics and actually challenge the Democratic Party establishment and win. Either as an independent or within the party. And so I think that we have to figure that out. A story that we tell a lot is, it was mind-blowing, like during the stand-up strike, to see the polling that was coming out around it. So like if you were to rewind back to 2008 and the Great Recession, a supermajority of Americans were like, let the big three fail, and they were blaming the workers, like the idea that you had a pension was somehow a harm against you, right? And now I think the tables have turned where people are so angry at the inequality that exists in this country. They're so angry about the experiences that they've had for the last 2 decades and seeing Wall Street do great and see all these companies do well while they're continuing to struggle to get by, that becomes a politics that can be channeled. Now, the problem is who's going to channel it, right? Is it going to be feckless Democrats? No, right? We're beholden to Uber and, whatever else out there. Or is it going to be a Donald Trump, right? A right-wing nationalist who's going to scapegoat immigrants and women and trans kids or whatever? Or is it going to be a left that's reinvigorated, a working class politics that speaks to the realities that people face, offers solutions, and a plan to be able to actually do it, right? And so we think that it's very possible to do that, but we need people to move into that space, right? We need more Dan Osbornes of the world, and then we need a lot more organizers. The organizing capacity is really desperate because billionaires are spending money hand over. They have so much more money to spend now in these elections, and they are going to do that, right? So we have to be able to meet the challenge of organized money with organized people, right? And that means we need an army of organizers out there that are capable of talking to people on their doors and meeting people where they're at and building them, bringing them into the coalition.
Right. So You're no longer at the UAW. You stepped down as Chief of Staff. What are your plans for the next, what's next for Chris Brooks?
I'm hoping to write a book on contract campaigns, bargaining, and strikes. I think it's really wild to me that there's not like one guide out there that you can just give a bargaining committee member that's like, here's how to think about these things, and pull them together and like some good tactics and ways to think about strategy. So I think that's a real deficit in the movement that I'm hoping to be able to help, address to some degree. Continue writing and reflecting on my experience. Hopefully be able to work with ASU to continue to do that, So very excited about the work that's happening here.
Okay, great. Chris, it's been great talking with you. I'm Michael McQuarrie, Director of the Center for Work and Democracy. Thank you for joining us today.